Ich begrüße Sie alle ganz herzlich. Es freut mich, dass so viele erschienen sind. Mir fällt es immer leichter, auf Deutsch zu sprechen, denn auf Englisch. Deswegen nütze ich diese Gelegenheit, aber ich werde weiter dann in Deutsch diese Einführung machen und unsere Vortragende heute vorstellen. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and students, I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you, and I am pleased that you have taken the time to participate in today's event. My particular greetings goes to our guests, whom I warmly welcome here in Innsbruck. It is a special pleasure and honor for me that we could win you, or you both, Asma Barlas and her husband, to be here, our guests. Before I turn the floor over to Asma, I'm honored to introduce her briefly. I empathize briefly because a more extended introduction would be also impossible, perhaps more appropriate because of her long academic career and her significant influence in shaping the discourse on the position of women in the Qur'an. I was blessed to visit her in the US, and we spent 2 intense days with her. So this visit helped me understand her approaches and to classify her thoughts. To avoid talking too much and taking time, I will present the vital data about her and hand the floor over. After the lecture, we will have the opportunity to ask and to have a discussion. So I will start with her academic career. She studied English, please correct me if I say something wrong, English literature and philosophy in Pakistan. Also, she has an MA in journalism, also from the University of Punjab, Lahore in Pakistan. I will not say the dates. International MA in International Studies at the University of Denver, and a PhD in International Studies, Graduate School of International Studies, University of Denver, Colorado. Her dissertation is about state, class and democracy, a comparative analysis of politics in Hindu and Muslim society in colonial India between 1885 and 1947. And if we look at the work history, she began as in a section officer, in Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Pakistan. Firstly, then she was assistant editor and columnist in a Muslim newspaper, The Muslim, in Pakistan. Research assistant at the Graduate School of International Studies. Then instructor in a Graduate School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Chair Department of Politics at the Ithaca College between 1998 and 2004. In 2008, she had the Spinoza Chair, Department of Philosophy, University of Amsterdam in Netherlands. And she was director of the Center for Study of Culture, Race and Ethnicity at Ithaca College, and I think a founding director of this. She was associated professor and assistant professor at Ithaca College, and professor for Department of Politics at the same college from 2004 to 2020, and now she is Professor Emerita of Politics at the same college since 2021.
Since 2020.
2020. Okay. So she has some summer teachings at the University of St. Petersburg, Institute of Linguistics, and also Faculty, School of Critical Muslim Studies, Decolonial Struggle and Liberation. It was the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Granada. Research interests are Islam, of course, it's normal, Quranic hermeneutics, Muslim sexual policies, race and colonialism, global and third world politics, US empire, politics of identity. So she has also many awards, so I will not mention all of them, but some of them I think I should mention. And I will start with Ithaca College Faculty Excellence Award, Ithaca College Summer Research Grants, some of them in many years, so I will not repeat it any time. State University of New York Award to teach in the New York State, visiting scholar, University of Utrecht in Netherlands, department, Theologie and Religious Education, department on Gender Studies, visiting fellow, International Center for Islam and Pluralism in Jakarta, Indonesia. And the book, Believing Woman, I suppose you know the book, is nominated for, I couldn't spell it, Greenwire Award in Religion also. And that's why I said briefly, because if I mention all the publications she has, we should stay here for longer than we have planned. So I will just mention again, Believing Woman in Islam, Understanding Patriarchal Interpretation of Qur'an is one of the...
Unreading.
And?
Unreading.
Unreading.
Patriarchal interpretations of the Qur'an.
Okay.
I don't want to understand them, I want to unread them.
Unread them, okay. And Re-Understanding Islam,
yes.
The book I get from her. A Double Critique Spinoza Lecture, University of Amsterdam, and many other, but you have to see them all. So now I'll turn the floor over to Asma, and I'm looking forward to her talk. And thank you very much again being here. It's a pleasure for us.
It's my honor.
And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum and good evening. Dear Professor Sejdini and colleagues, thank you very much for inviting me to talk on the Quran, Patriarchies and Muslim women. I always write down my comments because I want to stick to a time frame so we can have a dialogue. And I hate academics who go on and on for like much longer than the time, so I timed this. Basically, I hope to persuade you that reading the Quran as an anti-patriarchal text is more congruent with its references to God and the ontic equality of men and women than religious knowledge that projects sex and gender onto God and sex and gender biases into and inequalities into God's word. And so what do I mean by religious knowledge? Basically theology, tafsir and the hadith, all of which I argue violate the Quran's views of God and also propagate ideologies of male supremacy that justify discrimination and even violence against women in Muslim patriarchies. So when I speak about Muslim patriarchies, what I have in mind is a kind of a folk Islam, which is sort of a haphazard mix of cultural and religious myths and practices that are either missing from the Quran or refute its teachings outright, contradict and violate its teachings outright. So what do I mean by folk Islam? Well, amongst the most pervasive myths is that God created Hawa from Adam's rib, that she brought about his fall from paradise, that a male God favors men, whom he has made superior to women, and that husbands are their wives' rulers, and even earthly gods. I come from Pakistan, where Urdu is an artificial language which has a lot of Arabic, Persian and Turkish, and the religious texts say that your husband is your majazi Khuda, which is Persian for your earthly god. And among so-called Islamic practices that are not mentioned in the Quran are stoning, beheading as punishments, female genital cutting, honor killings, beating women for not veiling, and for that matter certain forms of veiling, covering yourself, and male and saint worship, to mention just a few. So I'm amongst those Muslims who grew up believing that the Quran actually authorized all this, and it was only over time that I learned to distinguish between the Quran and its interpretations, and therefore also between the Quran and what I'm calling folk Islam. So I'll start by sharing a little bit about how and why I came to read the Quran as I do. Two caveats. I use words like Muslim, men and women to describe general tendencies. So it's not meant to capture every single man, woman and Muslim. It's a general tendency. And sometimes I use the word we for people who might share perspectives like mine. So, the how and why, how did I come to read the Quran as I do? I was born in Pakistan, and I was educated from the ages of 4. 4 is when we go to school. From 4 to 15 in Catholic convents by European and local nuns. And I graduated from a Presbyterian college, which is just what my parents had done. They were born in British India when India was still under colonial rule. We spoke English as our first language at home, and we often had to sing hymns. Do you know what a hymn is? Yeah. We often had to sing hymns about God's Son, Jesus, in school, because of course it was Catholic school. So perhaps as a way to counter that, my parents decided that I should be taught to read the Quran at home, which I was, starting at the age of 11. But since none of my male tutors, the mullahs who taught me, knew Arabic, I didn't know what I was reading for many years. I mean, I read the Quran cover to cover, but I didn't know what it was saying. And it was only when I came across some English translations in my dad's study, and this would be sometimes around the age of maybe 15 or 16, that I started to understand what the Quran was saying. And I discovered that the Quran was mostly about God. Belief and disbelief, right and wrong conduct, parables of all sorts, and the mysteries of creation. I noticed but didn't pay much attention to the references to God as He, or to the few verses that spoke about men's rights over women, perhaps because I was living in a patriarchal society with a male-worshipping form of Islam. The phrase male worshipping is Abdul Wahab Adibas. He says the Islamic family was supposed to be male worshipping. Now, of course, I only realized this after the fact, not while I was younger. But something paradoxical happened, which is that the more I learned about God's self-disclosure, by which I mean how God describes God in the Quran, the more aware I became of some tensions in the text over the years. For instance, the Quran says God is unlike anything and everything in creation, and it forbids similitude, comparison for God, but then alludes to God as He and Him Himself. It tells us that God created men and women from the same nafs, made us both Khalifa and each other's awliya, wali. And yet, it designates husbands, their wives, guardians, or qawamun. A Grand Mufti of Cairo once said qawamun means men are the jailers of women. It counsels husbands to be kind to their wives, even the wives they're divorcing, or who might be their enemies. But then it says the husband can hit a disobedient wife. What makes disobedience worse than enmity and even adultery? I was in Istanbul last year, and Professor Janet Taslaman pointed out, what should have been obvious to me and never was, that if a man sees his wife committing adultery himself, not with 4 witnesses, but he himself, he's not allowed to beat her. So it seems a man can see his wife having sex with a man, but the Quran doesn't allow him to beat her. And yet, Muslims read this verse, 434, as well, if the wife disobeys you, you can beat her. And in Pakistan, you can beat your wife if your tea is cold, you don't like your food, or you don't like her face. So my view of God, or rather my understanding of Quranic concepts of God, conflicted with my understanding of God's speech. And I wanted desperately to try and disentangle the two, but didn't know how, or even if that was possible. It never struck me that such tensions might result from doing precisely that. In other words, disassociating Muslim conceptions of God from the Quran's conceptions of God on the one hand, and delinking the Quran, delinking conceptions of God when interpreting the Quran. In other words, delinking God and God's speech, while also breaking the Quran into parts. That's what the Quran says we do when we read it piecemeal. Is it too high to go? Too high. So when it says that it warns us against breaking it into parts, it means we should not be reading it, the word and the line, just to suit ourselves. And the reason I couldn't have imagined any of this is that well into my 30s, I'm 73 now, I had read the Quran on its own, knowing little about Islamic history or theology or philosophy or tafsir or the role of early Muslim rulers and classical scholars in shaping religious knowledge and methodology or scriptural hermeneutics or even patriarchy. So I was a pretty ignorant person. Here I was reading the Quran and struggling with these issues. So as a result, I was ignorant of what many others had known all along. Zakariya, may I ask please to some water in the glass? I'm sorry I didn't think to put it in there. I'm also asthmatic and I find it hard to speak for a long time. Thank you very much. So, thank you. Yes, please. So as a result, I was ignorant of what a lot of people already knew. For example, and I'm quoting Muhammad Arkum, these are his words. He says, the Quran has been, quote, ripped from its historical, linguistic, literary, and psychological contexts and then been continually recontextualized in various cultures and according to the ideological needs of various actors. And this is Neil Robinson, that there is a, I quote him, striking difference between what can be safely inferred from the Quran itself and what has frequently been read into it. And Leila Ahmed, she basically points out that different readings of the same text yield fundamentally different Islams. And that's partly because a lot of early Muslim scholars used to interpret the Quran by way of the Hadith, including many Hadith that contradict the Quran. I also even didn't know that Muslims and feminist critics speak of Islam as a religious patriarchy that has God on its side. That's the word. Those are the words of a woman, Fatma Sabah, who I think was Fatma Mernisi, writing under a different name, but I can't be sure. So, the truth though is that people who described Islam as a patriarchy never defined it patriarchy itself. And when I began writing Believing Women in 1995, I couldn't find any literature on the Quran and patriarchy, which is why I framed the book expressly to address that lack. Wadud's book, in which he said the Quran is neutral to social and marital patriarchy, came out in 1999, the same year I sent Believing Women to be published. So I did learn a lot from her, but even she felt that the Quran is neutral to patriarchy, but she also didn't define what she meant by it. So I felt that definitional clarity was important if I wanted to say that you can unread patriarchy from the Quran. Of course, we need to be clear as to what patriarchy is. So, Believing Women is what emerged from this process of learning. It took me several years to educate myself enough to write it. And it is premised on 4 major claims, and I'll summarize these before I discuss them. Muslim religious knowledge, the first claim I make in the book, is that Muslim religious knowledge masculinizes God by collapsing the signifier and the signified. In other words, God with language about God. But the Quran's use of Arabic pronouns for God doesn't mean God is literally, symbolically, figuratively, conceptually male. It's a function of Arabic. It's not a comment on divine ontology. And I substantiate this claim by looking at the 4 creator models, as Ian Netton calls them, that Muslims have used for God, all of which render God male. As does classical tafsir, as does the hadith. And the latter also imputes sex-gender partisanship to God by asserting that God is partial to men and has made them women's managers and overlords. This is how religious knowledge authorizes and indeed Islamizes male supremacy and sexual discrimination in Muslim patriarchies. My second claim is that since the Quran is God's word, what we ascribe to the Quran we are also ascribing to God. Instead of interpreting the Quran in ways that contravene its statements about God, we ought to read the Quran in light of its declarations about God. And I will explain that shortly. For instance, I take the principles of God's unity, Tawheed, inimitability, and justice as my framework for affirming the Quran's egalitarian and anti-patriarchal nature. Right now, just putting these ideas there, I will come back to them. But if anybody is confused by anything or you want to interrupt me, you should feel free to do so. A third premise is that, like all texts, the Quran is also polysemic. It has more than one meaning, since language has more than one meaning. And its meanings depend on who has read it, how, and in what context. In other words, there's a relationship between method and meaning, text and context, and between texts, what Julia Kristeva has called intertextuality. Now, this is an obvious point, but many Muslims treat classical tafsir as if it's the Quran's only possible and authentic and binding interpretation. And unfortunately, this tafsir injects ontological male privilege into the Quran and also treats the gender hierarchy of 7th century Arabia. It's a tribal Arab patriarchy in the 7th century, so there was a gender hierarchy there. And tafsir treats that hierarchy as being divinely ordained, as if God mandated that particular patriarchy and gender inequalities. Now, this is evident from tafsir of the hierarchy verses. This is what Aisha Hadayatullah calls those 5 or 6 verses out of, thousands in the Quran, which use words like daraba or kawamun and daraja, those couple of verses. And these all allude to male authority over women. But the truth, of course, is that we can read these verses, and they have been read differently. Not just by me, but by people who know Arabic and are experts in the language, which I am not. Furthermore, these verses can be contextualized. In other words, they can be read in the context of the times, because the Quran was very much addressing the times as well. And my own tendency is to want to try and differentiate between the universal and the particular in the Quran. By universal, I mean principles that hold across time and space and which are not culture bound and which are not time bound. And by specific, I obviously mean verses that address specific practices that no longer prevail. Lastly, in the absence of a definition of patriarchy, there's nothing to say that the Quran, as distinct from Islam, advocates patriarchal norms. That's what Musa says, Ibrahim Musa, that the Quran advocates patriarchal norms. I distinguish between Islam and the Quran because the Quran is a text, and Islam is, it comes out of interpreting it and practicing that text. So they're not the same, and you can't confuse, at least I can't confuse them. So by patriarchy, I mean two specific modes of male privilege and authority. One is older than Islam, and this was the rule of the father. The man as a father had the right of life and death over his kids and his wives. And the other is a more secular and modern form in which male authority is underpinned by a particular construction of sex and gender, so that biological differences between women and men are seen as establishing their gender inequalities. So if you're biologically a male, it follows that you have X and Y, X gender attributes, and if you are biologically a female, you are supposed to have Y gender attributes. And needless to say, men have all the good attributes and the women have all the negative ones. But the Quran itself, one of my claims is that the Quran doesn't go this route. So, are you with me about these two forms of patriarchy? One is a very old tradition of rule by the father/husband over wife and children, which you can see in many tribal societies, Muslim societies, but you could see in feudal Europe, so it's not particular to Islam. And the other is and I will read the formal definition of the second form of patriarchy, that it is a secular politics of sexual differentiation that transforms biological sex into politicized gender, which prioritizes the male while making the woman different, unequal, less than, or the other. I know that's a big definition. That's by my colleague Jahre Islamische Studien. She is a Marxist, socialist, anti-racist feminist. So simply put, modern patriarchies conflate biological sex with gender, which is a cultural meaning that we ascribe to be male and female, making women and men not just different, but unequal. So, how do I then apply this definition to read the Quran? Firstly, the Quran does not refer to God as a father or as male. And although Muslims draw parallels between God's rule and authority over human beings and men's rule and authority over women, the Quran does not do that. There is no literal or symbolic continuum between a male God and Father in heaven and human males on earth. And as far as the second form of patriarchy, the Quran does not have a view of gender. It does not say what it means to be biologically female or male. As in, because you are biologically a male, you're virtuous, upright, honest, talented, all the good things. Because you're biologically a female, you're defective, emotional, irrational, and so on and so forth. So there is no such definition of gender in the Quran, and Wadud also had pointed it out that there is no concept of gender man and woman in the Quran. So if we just go by the two definitions of patriarchy that I've given you, then the Quran's teachings can't be fitted into either model. Now, I wasn't content with just saying that. I actually looked at some of God's attributes, the three attributes I mentioned before, like Tawheed, for example, God's justice. So I want to share that, like how I read those attributes of God. As I understand it, the concept of Tawheed not only signals that God is one, but also that God is absolute sovereign. No one can partake in it. Not a king, not a man, not a prophet. God is utter and absolute sovereign. And to assign sovereignty in any way, shape, or form to anybody else is shirk. So the idea that men can be sovereign over women in a particular kind of way, according to me, is a form of shirk. So even, this is from the Quran, it's the translation by Muhammad Asad, it's 21:29. The Quran says that even if a prophet, I quote, were to say, "Behold, I am a deity beside him," that one, the Quran is saying, we should requite with hell. There are also references to King David and Solomon, and that they are sovereign over human beings by God's will. They're not sovereign in the way God is sovereign. I think it's a pretty straightforward thing. Not only does God reject being called father, in other words, being patriarchalized, but God also criticizes those who prefer to follow the ways of their fathers. There are several passages in the Quran that criticize human beings for preferring to follow the ways of their fathers in preference to the ways of God. So it's a direct juxtaposition between human fathers and God. But the clearest one is in the story, the parable of the prophet Abraham. Did you know that story in the Quran? Do people know does somebody know that story in the Quran? One faint nod, two nods here. No? So do you know that, Abraham's father worships idols, and when Abraham says, "Father, follow me, follow my guidance," guidance has come to, so the son is telling the father to follow him. And of course, Abraham's father and his cohort basically decide that Abraham should be thrown into the fire for challenging the fathers and their gods. But God saves Abraham from his father. Now remember, fast forward, and Abraham has a son who he is going to sacrifice with the son's permission, by the way. Does anyone know the difference between the biblical and Quranic account of the sacrifice? In the Bible, Abraham takes his son without telling him that he's going to sacrifice him to God. And they travel in silence for 3 days to Mount Moriah. And Abraham in the Bible, Genesis, binds his son, lays him down, is going to sacrifice him, and then at the last minute a lamb appears. But in the Quran, that's not what happens. Abraham has a vision or a dream, I mean, depending on how you interpret that, and he goes to the son and says, I had this dream about you, what do you think? And the son says, if that is the will of God, Father, I am ready. So once again, when Abraham is, both of them decide that, okay, Abraham is going to sacrifice his son, but then, Abraham gets this, again, vision that you have fulfilled your promise or your intent. So I do a careful reading of how Abraham, as a complete father who has the authority of life and death over his son, cannot sacrifice his son without his son's consent. So I read it as an anti-patriarchal parable, as the Quran's opposition to a certain form of rule by the father, a sort of a tyrannical rule, where the father feels that he can kill his son, even if it is for God. So that's so much for the Abrahamic narrative. As far as the Quran's declaration that God is unique and inimitable, I take that to mean that minimally God is not like us. That's minimum, that God is not male, God is not female, God doesn't have sex, God doesn't have gender, God is beyond our highest evolved thoughts. And there's 21:18, also by Asad, woe unto you all for your attempts at defining God. So I take this to mean that only the Quran's definitions of God count. And none of these suggest that God is like men, or God prefers men, or that there is a real or symbolic continuum between God's rule and men's rule. And yet, as I've said, I won't repeat it, classical tafsir and hadith equate the man with kind of a sovereign overlord. Thirdly, the Quran defines God's justice negatively, as in not doing zulm. And the meaning of zulm in the Quran, according to Toshihiko Izutsu, is to act in such a way as to transgress against the rights of another. Can you imagine how radical that is? God promises not to transgress against the rights of another, not to do zulm. So at a very minimum, I argue that we cannot or should not read zulm into the Quran either. If we believe that God doesn't do zulm, how can we say God's speech teaches us zulm? And of course we can disagree on what zulm means. We could be here forever talking about what zulm means. But my point is that any form of degradation of a human being constitutes zulm, and women are utterly degraded in patriarchies. Our humanity is denied, our rights are denied. So I think of patriarchy as a form of zulm. So that is for how I use those three attributes to interpret certain verses. And lastly, I apply some of the Quran's own interpretive criteria to it. I call it the Quran's auto-hermeneutics because it suggests certain criteria for how we should read it. He says we should read it as a whole, contextually, and for its best meanings. So let me cite the support for that. I don't have the verse number right here, but anyone who's interested, I'm sometimes called to give verse numbers, and then people from the audience interrupt me and say there is no such verse. Furthermore, this is not the right word for the verse, this is not the chapter for the verse, and so on and so forth. So you're very polite. So this Quran's support for textual holism emerges from the following. And say, I am indeed he that warneth openly and without ambiguity of just such wrath as we set down on those who divided scripture into arbitrary parts, so also on such as have made the Quran into shreds as they please. We will of a surety call them to account for all their deeds. Similarly, in a reference to the precepts given to the Prophet Moses, God condemns those, within I quote, who make it into separate sheets for show while you conceal much of its contents. The Quran's emphasis on reading it holistically is also evident from its praise for those who say, quote, "We believe in the book, the whole of it is from God." Okay, that's textualism in the Quran. So, in addition to intra-scriptural investigation, the Quran also enjoins an understanding of itself, which makes contextuality central and fundamental both to its existence and its relevance. That's a quote from Kenneth Cragg. He's a bishop who's written a wonderful book on the Quran. He notes that there are several important passages which underline the necessarily periodic and contextual nature of the Quran's contents. So one of the ways in which we account for history is to understand that the Quran does have a specific relationship to history, that it occurs within history and it occurs over 23 years. And so there are many ways in which we can actually contextualize it. You're students of theology, so you're more educated than me, so I will say this. I believe that revelation is always already both universal and particular. It is universal since it conveys enduring principles, and since scriptures can be reread from changing vantage points throughout time, which keeps them alive and relevant. And it is particular since it first occurred within an unfolding human history, not in timeless time or empty space, and it addressed people in the immediacy of their lives. So the Quran is both universal and particular. It's not an artificial division that's being imposed on it from the outside. Finally, the Quran gestures to its own policy by praising those, I quote from the Quran, who listen to the word and follow the best in it. Likewise, God tells the Prophet Moses to enjoin the people to hold fast by the best in the precepts. So in other words, the Quran itself recognizes that there are better and worse ways to read it. And remarkably, it puts the onus on us as believers to look for what is best. And of course, our notions of what is best are likely to change, because it's not a fixed concept. And so, to me, that is also one way in which the Quran remains universal, that we continue to search for its best meanings. The sad reality is that in Muslim societies, if I was giving this talk in Pakistan, which is my home country, I would probably have been stoned to death by now. But the point is that there is no freedom in our societies to talk about what is a better or worse reading of the Quran. We just accept what it is and keep our mouth shut, because if you open your mouth, then the wrath of man, I don't know about the wrath of God, will fall on you, especially if you're a woman. So, at this point, some of you may be wondering, well, what about those hierarchy verses, right? I mean, Muslims have hung an ontology of sexual oppression in them for 1400 years. And one of the criticisms is, who are you to come over here after 1400 years and tell us this is not what it is? So here I will want to make a couple of points about it. There are some verses that speak to men's authority, obviously. And the fact that the Quran speaks to men about women is also taken to be a sign that God doesn't treat women as subjects, because after all, God is speaking to men about women. So that's a sign of divine favoritism. But here's my take on it. The Quran's first audience was a tribal patriarchy in which men did have power and authority. And as such, for the Quran to have dealt with that authority and reality isn't the same as having mandated it for eternity. It addressed what was there. It didn't say this is divine. It was already existing in Arabia, and it moderated it. To believe that God mandated the 7th century tribal practices for eternity is to imply that an all-knowing God wouldn't have known that 7th century institutions and customs would pass away. A proposition we can only accept at the cost of assigning ignorance to God. And I personally cannot bring myself to do that. Moreover, and ironically, the very verses that Muslims read as irrefutably establishing men's authority over women severely limited its nature and scope if you read them in the context of their times. So, look at divorce. What did the Quran have to say about divorce? Of course, today they say that the Quran's provisions on divorce are very anti-women, and some Malaysian men have been divorcing their wives on Twitter. because 3 times you say, I divorce you, talaq, 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 you're divorced. The Quran doesn't say that though, that's bid'ah. That's a complete innovation. So basically, here's what the Quran did. It radically altered customary practices in the 7th century by forbidding an existing form of divorce on the appeals of a wife, forbidding men to keep divorcing the same wife, or expelling them from their homes during a divorce, and discouraging them from divorcing their wives just because they had gotten tired of them. God says, I may have put much good in that woman. So just because you're tired of her doesn't mean you should chuck her out. Incidentally, I already told you, you can't divorce your wife 3 times in a row and say, I'm done with you. Even in the confines of a 7th century tribal era patriarchy, the Quran gave wives the right to initiate a divorce, including from husbands whose nushuz they feared. I've lived to be pretty old, and I have never once heard a Muslim, not once, ever mention the husband's nushuz. It's always the woman's nushuz. And nushuz they translate as disobedience. So if I were to take that, I would say that a woman who fears her husband's disobedience can leave him then. If you were to use the same translation of nushuz, nobody talks about that. In addition, as I said, if a husband accuses his wife of adultery on his own witness, do you know what the Quran allows him to do? Yes, you do know that. Say it. Go ahead. You in the green. What does the Quran allow the wife to do if the husband says, oh, I saw her committing adultery?
He has to have witnesses.
Yeah, but if he doesn't have 4 witnesses, but he says, I saw her. No? Okay, so the guy comes, 4 men who have to see the act of penetration. That's a very high standard. What would 4 good men be standing around doing, watching? So if the man comes along and says, I saw her 4 times, she can deny his charge 4 times, and if she does, there the matter ends. The Quran doesn't say after this what should happen. There the matter ends. But we only always hear about, oh, 2 women are equal to 1 man, because in the question of transacting a debt, the Quran says if you can't get two men, get 1 man and 2 women, and so now there's a 2-for-1 formula, as Badud calls it. But in the much more important matter of adultery, the woman's word is the last. In addition, a lot of people say, oh, well, the Quran allows a man to marry multiple wives, but doesn't allow a woman to marry multiple husbands, and so forth. Well, polygyny was an existing practice. It predates Islam. I used to have to remind my Jewish and Christian students who would like roll their eyeballs that the Prophet had so many wives. I said King David had 900 wives and concubines, so enough with the eyeball roll. I mean, the Bible speaks about it, concubines. Even Abraham had 2 wives, so enough of that. And the Quran basically forbade men to marry women they previously could, or to inherit women against their wills, and it limited polygyny, while making it conditional on ensuring justice for orphans. So a lot of Muslim men feel like, oh, God gave us permission to have more women because men have a bigger sexual appetite. Well, that's not what the Quran is saying. The Quran isn't saying that men have a greater sexual need so they can have 4 wives. And then men divorce a woman who hasn't produced a son as if it's all her fault. He has to have a son, so he's going to. But those are not the reasons the Quran gives. And while the Quran recognizes the importance of sexual desire in a marriage, it forbids lewd behavior with wives, as well as sex with menstruating wives out of a concern for them. It's true that the Quran doesn't refer to women's sexual agency or the wife's consent, as a feminist critic has pointed out, that the Quran treats women as objects because there's no notion of consent in it. But the point is that the notion of consent is still new, and in the 7th century nobody knew it. And even today, and I live in the United States, I've lived there for 40 years, there are still people who do not accept or respect the idea of consent. To say that the Quran didn't talk about female sexual agency and consent in the 7th century is just as the British would say, bloody-minded, because that's really not historically a warranted critique. As for the 2 verses on sex in the Quran, they can be read historically and alongside those that counsel sukoon, love and mutuality in a marriage. So one of the criticisms of a feminist of the 2 verses on sex, which she calls very grandly the Quran's provisions on sex, are actually 2 verses. And we can read them historically, and we can read them in light of the verses on marriage, which say that a marriage should incline to sukoon. And Mustansir Mir, in his Dictionary of Arabic Terms in the Quran, says that sukoon is a state of mental satisfaction resulting from sexual satisfaction, but the point is that it's supposed to be harmony in a marriage. So, but this feminist also rejects applying principles like love and mercy to sex because she says the Quran doesn't explicitly do so. But that's the point of reading verses in light of each other, so that you can take principles from one and apply it to the other. So, I'm nearing the end of my talk. It was much longer, but I would rather just have more conversation with you. The word kivama, I have to go there. Because everything is like, oh, the man is qawamun, the man is qawamun. But I don't know classical tafsir, but I have read that Tabari once said that qawamun can also mean that you're just providing for the wife. And in fact, Aziza Al-Hibri has done a wonderfully close reading of this verse in pointing out precisely that. My own take is slightly different because I see it not as a man's right to be a qimama, but his obligation and his role. There's a difference. After all, not all men can take care of their wives, so it's not a right. It is a role and one that a man has to be willing to play. Significantly, where rights do exist in the Quran, it doesn't tie them to sex or gender. If anything, its teachings that men and women have been created from the same nafs, are God's Khalifa and each other's awliya, and will be judged by the measure of their own endeavors, affirm what I have been calling their ontic equality. That is also what Rifat Hassan has argued. Finally, there's this thing that the Quran treats the women and men differently. And I always point out that differences don't necessarily mean inequality. And treating people identically doesn't always mean treating them equally or fairly. It's important to recognize differences and to make space for them and to honor those. What about 434? I don't know if I really want to get into that verse. There's a German imam out over just across the border from you who was telling their husbands, beat your wives on the soles of their feet so that you don't leave any bruises on them, you know, because if you leave a bruise on a woman's face, maybe the cops will come around and say, what have you been doing here? So this imam very happily told the men, just hit them and beat them at the bottom of their feet. Now, again, you know, the Quran uses the word, the root of DRB in rubu. I mean, again, not as an expert, but I have read that there's 17 different ways in which the Quran uses it. And Lale Bakhtiar, who's dead now, she translated the Quran. She was also a convert, I believe, from Catholicism, I'm not sure. And she uses leave your wives instead of hit or strike your wives. But even if we take it to mean striking your wife, it's not an obligatory command. It doesn't make you a better Muslim. It's not amongst the 5 pillars of Islam. So you don't have to beat your wife to show that you are a pious Muslim. Just some general remarks by way of an ending. Believing Women has been out there since 2002. A lot has changed in the last 21 years, especially in the field of Quranic studies. It's grown exponentially. And for your generation, there is so much more than there was for mine. I didn't even know, as I confess to you, that it's possible to read the Quran any differently than it has been read. And what you do with that new knowledge, and how you read the Quran is, of course, entirely up to you. At the other end of the spectrum, there is also a movement to secularize the Quran, by which I mean trying to de-link it from God by saying it's just another text, either a cultural text or a historical text. It's not necessarily God's word. And we could very well end up with a theology in which God either doesn't speak or God's speech is no longer considered sacred and binding. For that matter, Muslims rarely speak of God while talking about the Quran. I have been giving these talks for 20 some years. I have not met more than half a dozen Muslims who have read the Quran. But everyone will abuse you in its name. We don't mention God in secular settings, because if we mention God, then people look at us pityingly, like, is this your obscurantist? So even at Quran conferences, people are talking of the Quran as if it just is there, authorless text. But without knowing the Quran, one also cannot know God. And this is a God who is beyond our perceptions, but closer to us than our jugular veins, who doesn't transgress against our rights, forbids compulsion and intermediation in religion, and is just and loving and patient, but also severe in retribution. Though forgiveness and mercy precede God's wrath. But strange to say, this God is nowhere visible in the practice of Islam, or even in canonical interpretations of God's word. So here is where I am in my journey with the Quran, which speaks of, and I quote the Quran, illiterates who know not the book, but see therein their own desires, and they do nothing but conjecture. That's Abdullah Yusuf Ali. I could well be among those illiterates, and I ask for God's mercy for what I've said, shouldn't have said, or failed to say about the book. Thank you.